Hello everybody, this is Dr. Everson coming to you again with some PowerPoints and some information on the book of Genesis. I wonder where we should start in this lecture today. How about at the beginning, huh? All right, who's with me? Great. So for today, we'll do a number of things with the book of Genesis. We'll do an overview. We will look at Abraham a little more closely. We'll look at the binding of Isaac. We'll look at some questions of history in the book of Genesis. There's all sorts of things that could be covered, and we're just going to begin to touch upon a few of these here. So anyway, the book of Genesis within the Pentateuch. One question we could start off with when looking at the Pentateuch is, why do we even have 5 books? The 5 books of Moses. Why don't we just have one book? In the ancient world, they did not have books, right? This is something you know. In the ancient world, they had scrolls. The scroll is something that was developed alongside of the alphabet, when people began to write on skins instead of pressing wedges into clay as they would do in Mesopotamia. They came up with scrolls, and when they filled up one sheet, one skin, they would simply sew another one to it to make it longer. And then when they were done, they would roll it up. This is the first method of creating texts in the ancient world, and it went on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It really wasn't until the time of Constantine in the Christian era that you have people writing books where you'd have leaves, instead of being strung out together in a long string, you would have leaves being stacked and sewn together on one side. And that was a new technology, which is sort of hard to imagine. But in the ancient world, having 5 separate books in this collection was in part a physical necessity. You couldn't carry around a scroll as large of the Pentateuch. Also within the 5 books of the Pentateuch, you have natural divisions. And within the book of Genesis, you have natural divisions as well. Most of us today like to think of the storyline, right? We divide things with the early stories that we have in Genesis 1 through 11, and then we look at the patriarchs as a whole from Genesis 12 to 50, or maybe we look at the patriarchal narratives individually. Within the book of Genesis, the author, whether that's Moses or somebody else, has his own divisions within the text. And this is the so-called Toledot formula. Ela Toledot is what you see there in Hebrew, and that could be translated as these are the generations. So this is a particular formula which is used to structure the book of Genesis. And this is useful in that it tells us how the author or authors of the book conceived of its overall structure. And the word Toledot, which is literally translated as generations, comes from the Hebrew verb yalad, which means to bring forth or beget. Yeled, for example, is a noun that means child in Hebrew. So if you look at all of the Toledot formulas, you'll see that they all refer to the offspring of humans within the book of Genesis. You have the generations of Noah, Shem, Terah, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, Jacob. Looking at this formula, you could say that a main concern for the book of Genesis is simply genealogy, and particularly the genealogy of the Pentateuch. That was a focus of the author. Now, as modern readers, we're really more concerned about what's happening within with the story itself. But anyway, for us modern readers, being focused more upon the narrative, a more useful division would simply be, as I said before, to divide it between the beginnings, Genesis 1 through 11, and the patriarchal narratives, Genesis 12 through 50. The first 11 chapters of Genesis takes us from the creation of the world all the way to Abraham, which really, if you think about it, is most of human history, right? Is encapsulated within these 11 chapters. And the various stories in here would include creation, Adam and Eve, the serpent and the apple, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, and also the Tower of Babel. And one thing that's distinctive about these chapters is that in the first part of Genesis, God is concerned with the entire world, as it were, and not just a particular family or a particular tribe or group of people. And so the focus is universal and not singular or individual. And looking at Genesis as a whole, and I think I may have mentioned this before, I think it's important to remember that this early part of Genesis, what I've called the beginnings, is a fraction, right? It's a little over a fifth of the entire book. So the focus of the author, the focus for the author of Genesis is the patriarchs. So the patriarchs cover Genesis chapters 12 through 50. And so the author of the book of Genesis is concerned with the history of one family in particular, namely that of Abraham and his descendants. Chapters 12 through 25 are devoted to Abraham, who is called by God to leave everything, right? Abraham lived in the city called Ur of the Chaldees. And he's called to leave that place and go live in a land called Canaan. And Abraham's promised three things in this journey. He's promised, I like to remember this with a mnemonic using the alliteration of the letter P, progeny, prosperity, property. He's promised progeny, namely offspring, that he would have descendants, right? And they would be as numerous as the stars of the sky or the sand of the seashore. He's promised prosperity. God says that he will be given a great name, and he will be made into a great nation. And he's also promised property, right? That there will be land that they will, in which they will live, and it will be theirs. In his old age, Sarah and Abraham are miraculously given a son. Abraham nearly sacrifices him in Genesis 22. We'll look more closely at that in just a minute. The next chapters 25 through 36 are devoted to Jacob. Now you might comment that somebody's missing in this lineup, right? So if you see on the slide there Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, and the person who's not mentioned is Isaac. And Isaac is given very little press in the book of Genesis. Chapter 24 is a story of Isaac going to find his wife. It's the longest chapter in the book of Genesis. His near sacrifice is described in 22, but then that's about it. Isaac is not prominently featured within the book of Genesis. Jacob, his name is related to, Yaakov in Hebrew literally means he grabs the heel, which probably refers to sort of a sneaky character. Some people would translate Yaakov as he cheats. Incidentally, the name James is a medieval way of saying Jacob. Jacob, if you look at your Greek New Testament, Iakobos is the name for the book of James. Iakobos becomes Yamos, becomes James for us. But anyway, Jacob has this name. And this is something we see throughout the book of Genesis, where the meaning of names are focused upon. And I'm kind of this way whenever I meet people, or say when I read your names in in our roster, I think about the meaning of names. And the book of Genesis is very much this way. And Jacob is described as a cunning, crafty person. Some people would call him a trickster. Anyway, through trickery, Jacob is able to receive the blessing of his father, Isaac, and he becomes the heir to the promise that was given to Abraham. Jacob also wrestles with an angel, and his name is then changed to Israel. Jacob, of course, famously has 12 sons. These become known as the sons of Israel. And chapters 37 through 50 in the book of Genesis are devoted to one of those sons, namely Joseph. And among Jacob's 12 sons, Joseph is his favorite. This should, if you've never read Genesis before, or you're unfamiliar with it, hopefully you've done your reading for this week, and none of this is new. But just for the sake of thoroughness, we're rehearsing it here. His brothers sent for him. His brothers resent him, and because of this, they fake his death. They sell him into slavery in Egypt, and there, with God's help, he manages to succeed and become an Egyptian ruler, probably a vizier down in Egypt. With the help of God, he manages to succeed. When his brothers come from Canaan to Egypt because of famine, he is able to save them from death. And therefore the descendants of Jacob or Israel, they reside in Egypt and they stay there with him. And this is where they multiply, and this sets the stage for the book of Exodus. So there's just a brief overview of the structure of Genesis. The author of Genesis lays out his own structure for it, focusing upon the different generations within the book of Genesis. As modern readers, we prefer to divide it between the beginnings and then the different patriarch episodes. Let's look a little more closely at Abraham. Abram in Hebrew means exalted father. Abraham means father of many. So Abraham's name is changed by God as the promise is being fulfilled. Abraham, of course, is the one with whom God makes a covenant. And what is a covenant? How would you describe it? Is it different than a contract? Is it the same thing as a contract? A covenant is, in my mind, very similar to a contract in that you have two parties are involved, and the expectations of both parties are described in the text, and also the consequences for not behaving according to the covenant are described. The language that's used in Hebrew, the word for covenant is brit, or it would have been pronounced breath, which later on in Ashkenazic Hebrew pronunciations becomes bris, and so the word bris is a way of saying is the Ashkenazi way of saying covenant. And so the bris, of course, within Judaism is the circumcision that's done 8 days after the male child, the son, is born. Okay, I won't make any social commentaries there. But it's a brit, and a covenant is cut. You cut a covenant. And one of the things we looked at just at the very start of this course, trying to understand what to do with the biblical text, was a description of the covenant described in Genesis chapter 15. And I have it here in front of me. Let's see. Yes. So the Lord said to him, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the two halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age." Skip down a little bit here, verse 17. When the sun had set and the darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot and a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said to him, "To your descendants I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites." Okay, so this is the covenant ceremony rapidly read out to you. And what exactly happened? There's certain types of animals that were taken and they were split in two. And then Abraham was put into a sort of sleep, and God passes between the pieces. Now, if you aren't acquainted with ancient ceremonies, you might just assume this is a weird ancient ceremony. But there's a logic to it. And one of the ways you can learn about this would be to look at ancient literature. And for example, I can remember in my Aramaic class reading the Sephira inscription, which is an ancient tradition where animals are cut in half, and this is something you would do to seal a deal. They didn't have the type of courts that we have today that would enforce these things. And what sort of ceremony or ritual could you do to symbolize the burden and the responsibility of both parties involved? And what they would do is they would take animals and they would cut them in half, and this would be a public ceremony that people could see. It would be a way of sort of professing and confessing what's going on. And what you're saying before the gods and the entire world, if you're an ancient Aramean, is, may this happen to me if I don't live up to my end of the deal. May I be severed in two and die a miserable death. It's sort of like cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye, as we would say as kids in English. And this is what Abraham begins to do with God, right? He's called to get these animals and separate them into pieces. And I'll just make a quick couple of comments about the ceremony. One thing that's interesting to me is God uses language and ideas that are familiar to Abraham. And the broader theological topic here would be the idea of contextualized revelation, that God reveals himself to people in the ancient world and in the modern world in ways that they understand. Right? He uses language that they understand. He uses ceremonies that they understand, customs that they understand, because we have a God who condescends to us, right? And though we are finite and he is infinite, though we are the creation and he is the creator, he reveals himself in ways that he can. He wants us to know him. Why is God known? Because he wants to be known. And I would say we see this in the book of Genesis, that this ceremony is used, right? This isn't what's done in the New Testament, but this is what is done for Abraham back then. And the second comment I would make would be, and this would tie in with Fee and Stewart, right? How to read a Bible, how to read the Bible for all it's worth. And it's this idea of understanding the historical context. Oftentimes you can read the Bible and you're not going to do severe damage to somebody's soul if you're not always paying attention to the historical context. Sometimes great clarity can be added to the text by understanding the historical context. And of course, I would say it's always a good idea to be aware of the historical context of anything you're reading. But in a passage such as this, I think it does great benefit to understand what's going on. I guess I would add a third point to this covenant ceremony that we see in Genesis 15, namely, who passes through the pieces, right? Abraham is put into a sleep and he doesn't pass through the pieces, but God passes through the pieces, right? And he becomes is he the more responsible party? Does the covenant land entirely on his shoulders, right? I think you could make a good argument that there's something to that God is the more responsible party, right? And of course, the descriptions of God as being merciful and graceful, even in the Old Testament, of course, would also go along with that. Let me just say a word here about Berit Diatheke and Testamentum. The word Berit, as we said before, is the Hebrew word for covenant. In Greek, the translation for covenant is Diatheke. And then in Latin, the Latin translation of covenant is testamentum. So when we say Old Testament and New Testament, we're really referring to the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And the phrase New Covenant, Berit Chadashah, goes back to Jeremiah, right? Jeremiah gives this prophecy saying, behold, the the Lord speaks through Jeremiah and says, behold, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant, right? And the law will be written on their hearts. And when the authors of the New Testament looked back on what Jeremiah had prophesied, they thought, aha, this is it. This is what God has been up to. And so just be aware that Old Testament, New Testament, these are terms for covenant, right? God had a covenant with the Israelites, well, more than one covenant with the Israelites. And then we have a new covenant in the days of Christ. Okay, so that's covenant. Abraham, of course, is often talked about in the New Testament. I don't know about you, but myself as a kid, there was the song Father Abraham, which is always a crowd pleaser for the kiddos at Vacation Bible School or whatever else, which is great. I love that stuff. I like to play instruments and sing that song with children too. This idea comes out of Galatians chapter 3. Let me just flip there real quick. This can be a bit... well, I would say when this was written back in the days of the New Testament, this was controversial. And of course, this is the whole conflict between Jews and Gentiles and who is a true follower of God. And in Galatians 3:29, we read, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Of course, the book of Galatians, Paul is dealing with a church that he founded in Turkey. In a region called Galatia, which would be in modern-day Turkey. Some people refer to ancient Turkey as Anatolia. And there were folks who came through after Paul, and of course were insisting that people sort of keep kosher, as it were. They should be keeping some of the fence around the Torah that I talk about in another lecture. Additional laws that were written needed to be kept by Gentiles. And Paul says this is another gospel. This isn't true. If you are a follower of Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, and that's what gets you in. It's not additional laws. Hebrews 11 and Romans 4 talk about Abraham's faith. Within Judaism, for the Pharisees, you see this talked about by Jesus in the New Testament, but you see it also in later rabbinic literature. This idea of the merit of Abraham, or as they would say in Hebrew, the zechut of Abraham, Zayin, Kaf, Vav, Tav, zechut. And it's this idea, it's sort of like what maybe you've heard the phrase cheap grace in Christian circles. And this is something that is often accused of certain Lutherans in their theology, like you say a prayer, you do the hokey pokey, you do it just the right way, and then you've got your fire insurance and everything's fine. All you have to do is make sure you walk down the Romans road with the track, and now you've said your prayer and you're fine, and you can go ahead and live whatever kind of life you've got, because now you've got God on the hook because you've gone through the technicality and you're into heaven, right? Of course, nobody overtly argues this type of theology, but it does sort of occur from time to time. People develop these attitudes. And there was this attitude too within ancient Judaism and within rabbinic Judaism that Abraham's our guy. We're descendants of Abraham. God's on the hook. Because of the merit of Abraham, we are automatically into heaven. And so Paul in Galatians points to Abraham, who is the true descendant of Abraham. And Paul in Galatians and in Romans, he links this to faith. So anywho, there's just a few thoughts on Abraham. Let's move on and talk a bit about the binding of Isaac. For some people, this is a wonderful passage within the book of Genesis. For others, they find it somewhat troubling. The word for binding in Hebrew is akedah, so ha'akedah would be the binding, and this is how it's often referred to. Well, that's how it's referred to in the reading cycle. It's also how it is referred to within sort of Jewish commentary on the Bible. Well, and before we start going through our points on the slide, what happens in the story, you find this in Genesis chapter 22. Finally, after many years, Abraham and Sarah have their son Isaac. And no sooner, it's a very short time after the birth of Isaac, that God calls out to Abraham and asks him to sacrifice his son. Child sacrifice is something that was known in the ancient world. I suspect it goes on around the world today, although I don't know where, and I guess I probably don't want to know where if it does. But this is a terrible thing. The Phoenicians were known for their child sacrifice, and others. And so anyway, for Abraham to believe that he was being called by God to sacrifice his son wasn't unthinkable. And Abraham obeys, right? The next day he goes out. He doesn't tell anyone what's going on, but he grabs a couple of servants and his son Isaac, and they begin traveling. And of course the text says, "You will go to a land that I will show you." So he begins this 3-day journey to a place he doesn't exactly know where it is. And this is a remarkable text. There's ambiguity within the text. For example, let me just flip there real quick. Abraham, in speaking with his servants, he says to them, "You stay here with the donkey. Isaac and I are going to go up onto the mountain and worship, and then we will come back." And like that passage, when Abraham says to his servants, "We will return," well, does he know that he's going to return? Is he saying that so they don't stop him, and he doesn't believe that they're both going to return? Why does he say we? Or does he have confidence that this isn't going to come through? And of course, that tension within the text is not resolved, right? Let me just read the first bit of the passage here. "Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about.' Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac." Okay, and then another tension within the text. Abraham, skipping down to verse 6 here, "Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, 'Father.' 'Yes, my son,' Abraham replied. 'The fire and the wood are here,' Isaac said, 'but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?' Abraham answered, 'God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son.'" Like there, Abraham saying God will provide. Do we know? We don't know what's inside Abraham's mind. Is he thinking that this is not, he's just trusting in God. We don't know what he's thinking. Does he trust that God's going to provide a lamb as he does, and Abraham and his son Isaac won't be sacrificed? But there's this ambiguity and this tension in the text, which I think is it's remarkable. And of course, it helps us that tension helps us begin to understand the tension that Abraham would have been feeling, trying to imagine the unimaginable, right? I mean, I can't put myself in his shoes. I can't imagine what I would be going through for Abraham. And he has 3 days to imagine this. His son's asking him, where is the sacrifice? God will provide. They're walking up the mountain, and it all comes to a head when Abraham is stopped. God sends a messenger, an angel, that stops Abraham from doing this. One person who wrote, I don't know if it was a treatise or a monograph. Actually, I've never read the whole thing. I think you could call it a short book, but would be a Dane a man from Denmark from the early 1800s named Søren Kierkegaard, or if you're pretentious, you might say Kierkegaard, as some people do. He is sometimes described as the founder of modern existentialism. I have become a bit of a student of philosophy in recent years, simply because I think existentialism sort of has won the the cultural war. If you go to a university, sort of the foundational beliefs, the principles of existentialism have thoroughly worked their way into the university system. And Kierkegaard would be the start of that. Some people would say it goes farther back to Descartes, who contemplated existence, right? I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. But Kierkegaard would be a foundational person for existentialism. And then after him, you would have folks like Nietzsche and Heidegger, Sartre, Camus, Foucault. All of these guys are very interesting. In fact, I was just watching, it's on Hulu if you want to watch it, but someone was reading The Myth of Sisyphus, the work by Camus, who was trying to contemplate the meaning of existence. And anyway, and the Coen brothers reject this. The Coen brothers remind me a lot of folks like Tolkien, and not to get too far afield with all of this, but there's some people like Tolkien would be one, Orwell would be another, Charles Dickens would be another. The idea that how do we fix the world? Is it through some great kingdom, or is it through some great hero, or is it through everyday people? And all of those authors would view the solution to the world's problems being found through everyday people, which, interestingly enough, Jesus talks this way when he refers to the kingdom of God. Okay, long story short, Fear and Trembling, written by Soren Kierkegaard. He wrote this with a pseudonym, and he wants to he wants to sort of grapple with the incomprehensible faith of Abraham. Right? Abraham, he doesn't question God, he doesn't complain, he doesn't weep, he doesn't explain himself to anyone, but he just willingly has faith in God. And for Soren Kierkegaard, Abraham was our example. And of course, Kierkegaard, writing at sort of the beginning of the modern period, Kierkegaard distinguishes between the tragic hero and the knight of faith, I think is the language that he used. So the tragic hero is someone who will give up everything in this moment, this climactic moment of resignation. And the knight of faith also makes the movement of infinite resignation, but he makes another movement as well. He makes this leap of faith, where by trusting and hoping, he is able to get back everything by virtue of the absurd. So anyway, and not that clarifies everything for Soren Kierkegaard, but if you want to look at a modern existentialist author who's grappling with this, which has enormous cultural impact for the modern world, and could benefit you perhaps looking at Soren Kierkegaard's description of this, could be very useful. Okay, Fear and Trembling. Interestingly, within the Jewish tradition, backing things up about a century, the Jewish tradition focuses upon the piety of Isaac. Isaac is described as someone who would have been old enough to fight back against Abraham quite easily as a teenager, and Abraham was an old man, and so Isaac sort of willingly sacrifices him. It's as if he's sacrificing himself. He willingly goes, and in fact he knows it's going to happen. And so if you read the Talmud, Isaac will say to his father, "Father, make sure you bind the cords tightly, because I might flinch, and if I were to flinch, then the sacrifice could be unclean. So you need to sacrifice me, correctly according to our Jewish law." And so that's interesting. Moriah, within tradition, Moriah was many people in the ancient world, many people in the modern world feel that the place where Abraham was supposed to take Isaac for his sacrifice was actually in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. And this isn't just Jews and Christians. There's also, of course, the famous Dome of the Rock, which I believe was built in the 9th century by Muslims in Jerusalem. And the Dome of the Rock is a mosque that is built around this rock, which was a sort of a foundational rock to the temple, and it was also the rock that within tradition was believed to be the very spot. So I just touched on a few things there for the binding of Isaac, but it is a remarkable text that really you could write a book on something like that. Okay, now shifting, let's go ahead and think about the patriarchs and history. History really deals with the idea of how do we know something is historically true. So within philosophy, it would be within the field of epistemology. How do you know if something's true or false? And you can get very philosophical with the idea of knowledge. How do you know if something's true? What's your attitude towards ancient sources in general is a question I could ask. You may view the Bible differently than other sources, and so for you, questioning the Bible's history it might not be on your radar. How do you respond to other people who are skeptical about the Bible's history? Myself, personally, I am very credible towards the Bible. I like to believe the Bible. I'm not incredulous, I'm credulous. And I'm that way towards other ancient sources too. My attitude is sort of innocent until proven guilty. And so, well, and something like, I'm sharing this information with you because there's very interesting historical corroboration for the patriarchs within the study of history. Some people like to look at the book of Genesis and the Pentateuch as a whole, focusing upon source criticism, and they quickly disregard Genesis as history. And I think people do that too quickly. We're going to talk about source criticism not this week. We'll talk about it later on as we go through the Pentateuch. But, okay, all that being said, patriarchs and history. Well, one thing to start with is that we only have the Bible as a historical source. There aren't other texts that mention Abraham. In fact, it would be strange if there were. Abraham was a man from the city of Ur. Ur was a very famous city in southern Mesopotamia. When it comes to determining the historical validity or the so-called historicity of the patriarchs, there's very little to work with outside of the Bible. This isn't a kingdom or an empire that built, tremendous structures or left libraries of texts. We're dealing with individual people who lived semi-nomadic lives or nomadic lives in the desert. Other sources can be used, however, to corroborate, to sort of support what the Bible says. But there are no external sources that directly validate or identify the patriarchs. And so we can't prove that the events happen as the Bible says unless you use the Bible as a credible historical source. But we can sort of see if things check out, as it were. Through the dating of the patriarchs, though the dating of the patriarchs is somewhat debated, it's safe to assume that if the patriarchs did exist, and I believe they did, it would have been in the early 2nd millennium BC, so about 4,000 years ago would be when the historical Abraham existed. Let's just take a quick look at geography. Abraham is described as coming from Ur of the Chaldees, and this place did exist. It's most likely the famous city of Ur in southern Babylonia or southern Mesopotamia. It's the archaeological site of Tel Mukayyar. Chaldees is used in the Hebrew to sometimes refer to the Arameans. However, it's also used to refer to the Kaldu people who lived in southern Babylonia. And so the language that the Bible uses fits. the city of Ur. I've heard estimates that they had. Well, I won't tell you what I've heard the estimated population is, but it was a massive city. It was one of the biggest cities the world would have known at that time. How about the migration of Abraham? Is this something that people did in the ancient world? Migration is something that's common for some times and places and not other times and places. Abraham would not have been alone when he migrated from Mesopotamia to Canaan during the early second millennium. His migration was a more difficult thing to do both before and after this period. That is to say, in the early second millennium, migration was common. It was less common before, it was less common after. With the fall of the so-called Ur III dynasty, and that's something we've not talked about and you're probably not familiar with, but with the fall of the dynasty in that time and place, the rule in that time and place, this was a period of shifting power and upheaval. Immigrants could move about with relative ease in Canaan as well during the early second millennium. Because Canaan at this time and place was a location of loose tribal leagues. And the information that I'm sharing with you comes from a guy named Kitchen, someone that I'm sometimes like and I sometimes don't like. He's an Egyptologist who wrote a book called The Historicity of the Old Testament. If this is something that interests you. Anyway, there was no single nation that dominated all of Canaan during this time period, and that wouldn't happen until later. So Abraham's migration, as described in the Bible, is a good fit for what we know about the history of ancient Mesopotamia and Canaan at this time period. The patriarchs in Egypt. According to Genesis 12, Abraham went down to Egypt because of a famine in Canaan. Also, the book of Genesis ends with Joseph and his family in Egypt. Semitic people were known to have migrated to Egypt during the second millennium as well. Right? So Ur was a famous historical place. Migrating from Ur to Canaan would have worked during this time period, and there were Semitic peoples in Egypt during this time period as well. So for example, the Hyksos, maybe you've heard of the Hyksos, Hyksos. The Hyksos were people that ruled over Egypt during the 17th and 16th centuries BC, right? So the rule of the Hyksos is an example of Semitic peoples settling in Egypt. How about some of the customs that we see in the patriarchal narratives? So one thing that's mentioned is the idea of heir by proxy. In Genesis 15, verse 2, Abraham says, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a slave born in my house will be my heir." So, as you probably know, Abraham and Sarah have difficulty in having a child. And one of their solutions to this would be that they would adopt a son, namely Eliezer of Damascus would be the adopted heir to them. And this is something that we know people would be, right? You would have an heir by adoption. And this in fact shows up in texts that come from the so-called Old Babylonian period. Hammurabi is perhaps one of the most famous kings known from the ancient world, and he comes from the 18th century BC. And in the Code of Hammurabi and from other texts from that same time period, namely the Mari tablets, M-A-R-I, the idea of heir by adoption and heir by proxy are both described. Heir by proxy, of course, would be Hagar. Hagar was the Egyptian slave, the Egyptian servant, bondservant. I don't know. I'm not sure. We'll save bond service for a later discussion. But anyway, Hagar was their servant. And if a wife could not conceive a child, a maidservant could be used to provide the child, which to us, it sounds weird, and there seems to be, ethical problems wrapped up in all of this. But in ancient cultures, this was considered normal, right? This is something that people could do. And this is the plan B that Abraham and Sarah go for. Of course, this is not what God had intended, and it doesn't end up being the ultimate solution to their problems. But this is something that we see in literature from the time. Their actions were normal for the second millennium BC. So the Code of Hammurabi, as well as the Nuzi tablets, N-U-Z-I, and there's an old Assyrian document as well that describes this sort of behavior. Let me just quote from an old Assyrian document from Turkey or Anatolia that reads, "If within 2 years she does not produce children for him, she herself may buy a servant woman. Then after the servant woman has had a child by him, then he may sell her off where he wishes." And this sounds very much like what is done with Hagar. Okay, so the customs that are described in the patriarchal narratives fit with what we know about the second millennium ancient Near East. Something else that fits would be the names. All names that within the patriarchal narrative, we have names that begin with an I or a J, namely Yaakov, Yitzchak, Yosef, Ishmael, right? They all begin with this Hebrew yod. And these look like the so-called Amorite imperfective. These were terribly common in the early second millennium, and they become much less common after this time period. So the patriarchal names fit with the customs for names during this time period. This would suggest that the names, and perhaps some of the traditions that preserve them, date back to this time period. If they were purely concocted or made up hundreds or thousands of years later, it would be too remarkable for the writers to create such period-correct names. Perhaps, or maybe they would just be really good at it. Also, names including Av, or Ach, or Am, which would be father, brother, or people, are consistent with this time period as well. And some would argue that they demonstrate a nomadic connection between clan and family. Av, father, Ach, brother, Am, people. And in the patriarchal narratives, we see Abraham, Abimelech, Abida, Abihu, Abijah, Ahuzath, Eli, Ahasimach, Ahiezer, Ahiar, Amishadai, Ben Ami, and Amalek. Okay, and then one other potential problem for the patriarchal narratives in history would be the idea of anachronisms. Of course, an anachronism is something that is out of time or out of place historically, right? So if you're reading in the New Testament and it describes Jesus hopping on his motorcycle, you might say, oh, hold on a second there were motorcycles back then. And some people point to the Pentateuch and they see anachronisms, such as references to camels, the city of Dan, or a group of people called the Philistines. Camels are often cited as an anachronistic feature of the patriarchal narratives, since camels were essentially absent from Canaan during the patriarchal period. One thing to consider, though, is that camels were not common in Canaan during the early second millennium. They were not entirely absent. So there are a number of external sources that refer to camels in Canaan during this time period. So sure, they weren't common, but that doesn't mean they were entirely absent. The city of Dan is mentioned in Genesis 14:14, and the city of Dan was not named after a guy named Dan who was born. The city of Dan is named after Dan, who was born long after this incident. And so some people would say, aha, this looks like a late date for composition. However, it's entirely possible that this is simply an updated term for a city that would one day be renamed Dan. right? So New York used to be called New Amsterdam, but now it's called New York. And so when you talk about the early days of New York, you might not use the right term. Or St. Paul was once called Pig's Eye, as some of you may know. The Philistines didn't migrate to Canaan until the 12th century or so. The Mycenaeans, maybe you've heard of Bronze Age Greek civilizations like the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were Greeks who settled on the southeast shores of the Mediterranean, right? And these people become the Philistines. However, this could be an updated term similar to Dan as a way of mentioning the non-Canaanites from this time period. So anyway, I know some of that might be a little bit boring or tedious, but if you really want to look into these things and question the history of the Bible, there are some very remarkable, smart people who have spent time investigating a lot of these questions. And there's quite a lot of material for defense if sort of defending the integrity of the Bible is something that is important to you. So anyway, that's the history. And then let me just say a few words about Joseph in history. You see the image here is the famous Ibsha relief, which is you're looking at a picture that's about 4,000 years old, which is absolutely remarkable, right? You're looking at the artwork from a person's hand that put that artwork on the wall 4,000 years ago. This Ibsha relief portrays the settlement of Semitic people in the land of Egypt, right? They come as nomads bringing their herds of animals. The men are portrayed as people with beards, as Semites were known to have, whereas the Egyptians were always portrayed as beardless. Okay, anyway, Semites in Egypt. As I said shortly before, in the early second millennium, this was a popular time for Semitic people being in Egypt. And so they were there. There are Egyptian sources that describe Semites settling there in Egypt in the about 4,000 years ago. In Genesis 37:28, we have a price that's given for slavery. And let me just flip there real quick. Genesis 37:28 reads, "So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt." This is about the right price for a slave in 18th century Egypt. You know, I'm part of me is uncomfortable talking about the sale price of a human being, but this is something that you see throughout the ancient world. In fact, slavery sort of ends very recently in human history. According to Kitchen, prior to this period, prior to the 18th century, slaves were much cheaper, and later they were much more expensive. So as you move from the so-called Middle Bronze Age to the Late Bronze Age, the price of slaves is on the rise. The price mentioned in Genesis is about what it should be for this time period. And he bases this on the Code of Hammurabi, the Mari tablets, and the Nudzi tablets. And then he also looks at Ugaritic literature, which is Canaanite literature from a later time period. And the later sources, slaves go for a higher price, as he said. Okay, so the price of slavery sort of checks out within the Joseph narrative. How about names and titles? So in Genesis 41:45, then Pharaoh, let me just read it for you here. Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphanath Paneah. Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphanath Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife, and Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. These four names are essentially what they should be. right? So kitchen also goes through the names that are given in this verse 41-45 and says that these sort of check out for sort of proper Egyptian names during this time period. Many numbers in the Old Testament are symbolic, or many people see symbolism in the numbers of the Old Testament. As readers are trying to understand the text, this can be useful when you're trying to understand somebody's age or stated period of time, for their existence. For example, 40 years becomes the number for a generation. In the Old Testament, a ripe old age, or a respectable age for someone to die, is 80. In Psalm 90, verse 10, it reads, "As for the days of our life, they contain 70 years, or, if due to strength, 80 years. Yet their pride is but labor and sorrow, for soon it is gone, and we fly away." Within Egyptian literature, it wasn't 80. The ripe old age was a bit older. It was 110. And so it probably isn't a coincidence that this is the age that's given for Joseph's death in Genesis chapter 50, verse 22, being consistent with this Egyptian tradition. So there's no specific external evidence outside of the Bible that sort of proves or can verify that this is historically true, but in a number of places within the patriarchal narratives, we find corroboration with history, and oftentimes within the biblical text, this is sort of the state of affairs, right? And so for me, it's very encouraging, and it's a good thing to know that the Bible can be supported. When we can check the Bible's history, it does check out. And this is, of course, this just isn't for the patriarchal narratives. It's for other places as well. Okay, well, thanks for hanging with me through all that, and hope you guys have a great day.